In Stockholm right now, engineers are digging a brand new subway line. New tunnel, new track, new stations, new signaling. The whole system, built from nothing. That project works out to roughly $190 million per kilometer. In Chicago, one station is being rebuilt under a project valued at roughly $444 million. Not a new line, not a new tunnel. One stop, on tracks that were already there, on a structure that was already standing. So here's the question this video is actually trying to answer. How does rebuilding one existing station cost more than the reported cost per kilometer of an entirely new subway project in Stockholm? Here's the catch though. The Stockholm number buys a kilometer of infrastructure. Chicago's number buys a station. Those aren't the same unit, and this isn't a price comparison, it's a warning sign. Worth noting too, that $190 million figure isn't some best-case number Stockholm hit on the first try. The project's budget actually grew from an earlier estimate to get there. It's a real current cost, not an optimistic one, which makes it a fairer yardstick, not a cherry-picked one. Something is making American transit construction expensive in a way that scope alone doesn't explain. Follow one project from its first estimate to its final bill, and you can start to see what. The station at the center of this is State and Lake, and the agency responsible for it is the CTA, the Chicago Transit Authority. The CTA didn't choose to build a landmark. It inherited one. State Lake opened in 1895, and by 2025 it was still carrying more riders than almost any other stop in the system. Fifth highest ridership out of the entire network, on platforms that had never once had a working elevator. That's the station the CTA had to fix. What it decided to build instead is the story. On January 5, 2026, the CTA pulled the plug. Trains stopped calling at State-Lake entirely, rerouted to Washington-Wabash and Clark Lake instead. Demolition followed fast. By April, almost nothing remained of the platform that had stood there for 130 years. On April 9th, the city issued a construction permit valued at roughly $445 million, with the architecture firm Skidmore, Owings & Merrill leading the design. The CTA says the new station opens in 2029. That number has a paper trail. 3 numbers. Same station. Less than 10 years. In 2017, the CTA's own estimate was $75 million for a much smaller project, widened platforms and a single ADA elevator, nothing more. By 2021, the city had unveiled a completely different plan: 4 elevators, a full glass canopy, double-width platforms, a new connection down to the Red Line subway below, and priced it at $180 million. By the time construction actually began in 2026, that same design had landed at $444 million. The first question isn't why $444 million sounds expensive. It's why the estimate changed at all. And that distinction matters, because a project can become more expensive for 2 very different reasons. The thing being built can get bigger, or the price of building the same thing can simply rise. Here's what the record actually supports. Between 2017 and 2021, the project got bigger. That's confirmed. The original plan was a platform and elevator refresh. What replaced it was a full reconstruction: 4 new elevators, a glass canopy, wider platforms, and a physical link to the Red Line platform sitting directly beneath the station, closing a gap that had forced riders to leave paid fare control and walk at street level to transfer, something CTA's own station records describe for decades. That expansion of scope explains the jump from $75 million to $180 million. What it doesn't explain is the next jump, from $180 million to $444 million, because the scope barely changed in between. News coverage of the project attributes that later increase to rising construction costs. In general terms, there's no public line item breakdown showing where, specifically, that additional $264 million went. Put the 2 jumps side by side, and they tell different stories. The station didn't get 6 times more expensive because one thing went wrong. It happened in 2 separate stages, for 2 separate reasons. The first stage, from $75 million to $180 million, has a documented explanation: more elevators, a canopy, the Red Line link. The second stage, from $180 million to $444 million, doesn't, at least not one that's been made public. One number has an explanation attached to it. The other, so far, doesn't. That connection to the red line is worth pausing on, because it's the part of the 2021 redesign that changes daily life the most. For decades, riders transferring between the elevated platform and the subway below, two structures separated by less than a city block, built 4 decades apart, had to leave paid fare control, walk out to street level, and re-enter through a separate turnstile to finish the trip. CTA's own station history documents that walking transfer, going back to the 1990s, patched over the years with new fare card machines but never physically closed. The 2021 redesign finally puts that connection inside the paid zone. It's a real improvement. It's also the one piece of this project's added scope that's fully verifiable, which is exactly why it's a fair place to draw the line between what we know and what we're inferring. So here's an honest split. What we know: the project's scope expanded once, clearly, between 2017 and 2021. What research on transit construction tells us: rising material costs, constrained job sites, and customized design are documented cost drivers nationally. What we cannot prove, for this specific station, exactly how many of those additional dollars came from each factor. Nobody has opened the $444 million and shown a receipt. Steel prices can move an estimate, but they don't plausibly explain a 6-fold increase by themselves. Steel is a globally traded commodity, and a ton doesn't cost dramatically more in Chicago than in Paris or Stockholm, tariffs aside. Higher American wages alone don't explain the international gap either. Labor's share of costs can run higher in the US than in countries like Sweden or Italy, but that's a partial factor, not a sufficient one. Station size doesn't fully explain it, since bigger, denser European systems still tend to come in cheaper overall. Each of these is a real pressure. None of them, alone, closes a gap this large. The bigger difference shows up when you stop asking what the station is made of and start asking how the city has to build it. Chicago didn't eliminate disruption during construction. It compressed it into short windows. Sidewalks and business access stayed open throughout. But State Street itself has seen real, scheduled full closures, entire weekends where it's shut to vehicle and bus traffic end to end, so crews can work around the clock, plus a long-term closure of one direction that stayed in place for months to avoid repeated detours. Lake Street, meanwhile, has been narrowed to local traffic only. Crews get uninterrupted access to the structure above the street only during those scheduled closures. The rest of the time, work happens at night, in phases, around traffic that keeps moving. This isn't a guess about Chicago specifically. It matches a trade-off researchers have flagged nationally. When a city won't shut a corridor down for a project's full duration, crews often shift to overnight and weekend shifts instead of continuous daytime work, at premium labor rates. Some cities treat a temporary full closure as worth it for faster, cheaper construction. Chicago chose the opposite: short, intensive closure windows with continuous access to the corridor otherwise. CTA's own advisories confirm the pattern in practice. During 2 weekends in July 2026 alone, the entire loop elevated system was rerouted so crews could get round-the-clock access to steelwork above the intersection. The trade-off is straightforward. Shorter work windows can mean more setup, more coordination, and less productive time per closure. Keeping the corridor mostly open isn't free. Chicago just doesn't send you the bill for it directly. There's a second pressure that may matter, and it's visible before construction even starts: the design itself. Some major American transit projects lean on one-off station designs, built from scratch, instead of a standardized kit of parts. That doesn't mean State-Lake's glass canopy and salvaged ironwork explain hundreds of millions of dollars. Nobody has shown that math. What it does mean is that Chicago is choosing a design with fewer opportunities for repetition than a standardized system offers. Madrid's most recent metro extension, Line 9, built 2 new stations for roughly $14 million each, about a fifth of that project's total cost, using standard uniform designs and simple materials, and officials credited that standardization directly for the low number. Copenhagen took a similar approach on its City Circle line, treating each station as a kit of parts that shared core components while still allowing local character. State Lake is the opposite bet. A bird-safe fritted glass canopy, salvaged 1895 railings reused around the new kiosks, a design meant to echo Chicago's own architectural history. It's genuinely striking. It's also, by definition, harder to mass-produce. Neither pressure is unique to Chicago. The 95th Dan Ryan Red Line Terminal, finished in 2019, ran about $290 million, but that was a full terminal rebuild, a different scale of project. The Green Line's Damon Station, opened in 2024, cost roughly $80 million. A new infill station, not a century-old structure threaded through a live downtown intersection. They aren't price tags for identical products. What they show is that the CTA has repeatedly faced high costs rebuilding stations inside a system that never stops running. Not that all three should have cost the same. But there's a problem with stopping the explanation here. We can identify the scope change. We can identify the construction constraints. We can identify the design choices. What we can't currently do is open the $444 million and point to $80 million here, $50 million there, and say, this is exactly where the number grew. And that missing breakdown is itself part of the story, because if the public record can't account for its own number, that's not a footnote, it's the finding. Before calling any of it waste, look at what Chicago is actually buying. Platforms roughly double their current width, a continuous glass canopy over both sides. Elevators the station has never had in 130 years. Escalators are coming back too, 63 years after the CTA first installed them here, and decades after tearing them out. The question isn't whether Chicago is getting something for $444 million. It is. The harder question is whether Chicago has found an affordable way to build it. That's a different question than, was this a scandal? And it's worth being precise about the difference. An expensive station isn't automatically a wasteful one. Riders are getting real overdue upgrades. Accessibility this station has never had in 130 years, a physical connection that should have existed decades ago. The question isn't whether that's worth paying for. It's whether the price Chicago is paying reflects what the station needed, or reflects something else. A system that has quietly gotten more expensive to build in, one closure window and one custom detail at a time, without anyone having to explain why. The reaction has split along a familiar line. Critics see an extravagant station in a system with more urgent needs. Supporters see infrastructure built to last another century. But beneath both arguments sits a national pattern, not just a local one. An ENO Center for Transportation analysis of 180 transit projects found that American rail transit costs run roughly 50% higher per mile than comparable projects in Europe and Canada, a gap that widens sharply once New York's most extreme projects are counted. Researcher Alon Levy has pointed to New York's East Side Access Project running at more than 10 times the international average his research group tracks. ENO's own research points to something broader than engineering complexity alone. Procurement practices, contractor risk pricing, and fragmented project management all compound the same way State Lake's scope and design choices do. State Lake isn't East Side Access. It's not close to that extreme, and it shouldn't be mistaken for it. But it shows the same shape of problem in miniature, at a scale ordinary enough that it's easy to overlook. A station that got more expensive for reasons that are only partly visible in the public record, inside a country that has struggled with this exact pattern, on projects large and small, for years. The United States doesn't only have a transit funding problem. It has a transit construction cost problem. And it shows up quietly, station by station, long before anyone gets around to asking why an estimate tripled. State Lake will eventually give Chicago wider platforms, elevators, a new canopy, and a real connection to the rest of the system. Those things have value. The open question is whether Chicago found an affordable way to build them, or whether the estimate simply grew the way American transit estimates tend to grow, quietly, without an itemized answer for where the money went. Because if the second explanation is closer to true, $444 million isn't the story of one expensive station, it's the price of the way America builds. So, what do you think? Drop your answer in the comments. Subscribe for more deep dives into the infrastructure decisions shaping American cities.